Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with unwavering commitment to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. Thank you so very much for joining me today. If, dear friends and viewers and listeners, you find the conversations on this channel enlightening, entertaining, edifying, stimulating to the mind, or nourishing to the soul, please do consider subscribing to this modest little channel of mine. On it, we have a small but growing community of inquisitive minds, among which I can assure you, my friend, yours most certainly belongs. Now, my guest today, with whom I am absolutely honored to be able to spend a little bit of time, is Dean King. Dean is the celebrated author of 10 books, all in the genre of nonfiction, an intrepid explorer and indefatigable researcher. Dean has traveled all over the world to write about subjects ranging from the Sahara Desert, the Hatfields and McCoys, Appalachian America, Patrick O'Brien, the High Seas, and the Long March in China. His latest book, and that on which we'll be spending a little bit of time today, and of which I strongly urge you all to buy yourself a copy, is Guardians of the Valley, John Muir and the Friendship That Saved Yosemite. If all these fine works don't quite satisfy your appetite for history and adventure, you can find more of Dean's published work in the Daily Telegraph, National Geographic, and the New York Times. And if all that weren't enough, Dean's also involved as a documentarian with Gum Street Productions, a young company in which he's a partner. Dean, thank you so very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, it's a pleasure, and it really truly is all mine. So I want to begin with a brief quotation with which we can most, I think, easily transition into the topic of your latest book. Published in the Yosemite in the year 1912, John Muir, the subject and hero of your most recent book, wrote, quote, "Damn Hetchy. As well damn for water tanks the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the heart of man." First of all, to all of us listening, what is Hetchy? Some might not be familiar with it. And why would its damning be tantamount to an act of sacrilege?
Well, Hetchy is a valley in the northwest corner of Yosemite National Park. And that's a great quote to choose because it really does capture John Muir's belief that nature was God's temple, his greatest manifestation, and also the place where people could come to find spiritual meaning and fulfillment. San Francisco needed water, and the cheapest and easiest way for them to get it was to dam Hetchy because it had steep stone walls on either side and a very narrow mouth. And because it was a part of a national park, if San Francisco could get the federal government to give it to them, they wouldn't have to pay for it. They wouldn't have to condemn any property below or fight for other rights. And so this would be Muir's ultimate battle before his death for the last 15 years of his life, was to prevent San Francisco from taking Hetchy, damming it up, and really usurping a major portion of Yosemite National Park.
Right, and he wasn't alone in this effort to preserve Hetchy from the, let's say, the incursions of the state that wanted it dammed and wanted its water supply diverted to service the inhabitants of San Francisco. Can you tell us a little bit more about the dramatis personae, the other characters involved in this story? Maybe you can touch on John Muir and give us a little bit more background on him and some of his fellow actors in this scene.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, this was sort of the culmination of the great service John Muir would do for the environment, for the environmental movement in the United States. So going back in time, Muir was considered he was a nature bard, and his editor, a guy named Robert Underwood Johnson at Century Magazine, would become the guy who turned Muir from simply a poet of nature into somebody who actuated his his greatest desires for nature in a way to preserve and protect nature. And to me, this was one of it's one of the greatest writer editor partnerships in the English language. And it was something I very much wanted to capture in the book because I don't think we've ever seen the likes of it before. Together, they created the Sierra Club, and so they had the Sierra Club, that apparatus to help them fight against the city of San Francisco, which had money and power, and it also had political chits because in 1906, the great earthquake and fire had destroyed San Francisco, and so a battle that they had been losing for the decade before, trying to take a piece of the national park, suddenly became something that they could achieve because people wanted to do something for San Francisco. Still, so San Francisco was asking Congress to grant them the water rights to Hetchy and give them the ability to go dam it up and take that water out, and it really was going to take a big piece of the park away. Muir and the Sierra Club argued that that Yosemite National Park had been created for all people, all Americans, and all people on Earth. Really, it's really a special, amazingly beautiful natural site, and that it shouldn't be taken for any purpose. They also could show that there were other rivers that San Francisco could use, and that they really didn't need to take a piece of the park. And for many years, secretaries of the Interior and presidents supported Muir and the Sierra Club and Robert Underwood Johnson in their efforts to preserve that beautiful piece of nature. And then once the earthquake and fire happened, the tide turned against them. Still a big legal battle. The Sierra Club used its grassroots to campaign against San Francisco. So congressmen were getting 5,000 letters on their desks, and each. And they had never seen this before. They were like, "What is this? What's going on?" And it was because Muir and the Sierra Club had expanded their reach across the country. It was the first time that garden clubs and women's clubs and faculty groups across the nation were fighting for a piece of nature that wasn't in their backyard. And so this was very transformative, and really created the modern environmental movement.
Yeah, and I want to touch on that a little bit more later because, like you said, this movement attracted disparate small groups or large groups all across the nation. And many of these people in these groups had never been out west. They'd never traveled to California. And really, in this time, a time prior to the wide distribution of photographs that we enjoy today, they might not even had much of a conception of it beyond the writings of a person, a bard of nature like John Muir, who was able to describe them in such memorable terms. I want to go back, though, very briefly to the unacknowledged partnership that between Mr. Johnson and Muir. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about Robert Underwood Johnson, who is, I think, by history, or at least American history, largely overlooked. Give us a little bit more detail about him. Why was he an important player in this?
Yeah. So I came to this book originally when I went to Yosemite National Park in 1998, took in the view from Inspiration Point and was duly inspired by that magnificent view, being an East Coast kid who had been in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd been to Europe more than I'd been to the West. And suddenly the scale and scope of the American landscape hit home hard there. And I realized I sort of had a new understanding of what America was all about. And so I really wanted to explore that, and I wanted to write about it. I started, then I discovered that John Muir was the sort of physical embodiment of that place. And I started studying his life, and there was a lot. He did a lot of amazing things, and you could go in many directions to tell his story. What I realized is that he had kind of a sprawling life. He did so many things. He was a bit of a mechanical genius. He was, a bit of a scientist. He was an alpinist. He was a fruit farmer even, and of course a great writer. But when I got to his relationship with his editor at Century Magazine, and saw that in one particular case especially, the first time they actually met was in 1889 when Robert Underwood Johnson came from New York City out to California to do finish off a series on the gold rush. And Muir said, look, Johnson, you got to come to Yosemite with me. You've been hearing about it for so long. Let's go. And Johnson, it didn't take much arm twisting. He was glad to go out there with Muir and to be led by, the great guide of Yosemite Valley. And but Muir wanted to show him that it wasn't being kept up. He wanted to show him the magnificence of it, of course, but he was also wanted to show him that the valley was being abused. It was under state control, but the tourism industry was kind of having its way. There were cow pastures and pig pens all over the place, and hotels were going up willy-nilly, and landscape was getting cut down sort of randomly, and there were garbage heaps and that sort of thing. And Muir also knew that from being a shepherd there in his early years, that the sheep up above the valley were denuding the mountainsides, and he knew that sooner or later erosion was going to kill the streams, and really it was going to affect the valley and ruin it. And so here he had Johnson. Johnson became convinced, and Johnson said to him around a campfire one night, he said, "Look, listen, Muir, we need to do something about this. We need to create Yosemite National Park, as we've been discussing. You write me 2 articles. I'm going to run them in Century Magazine. Then I'm going to go down to Washington, D.C. and put them on every congressman's desk. We're going to get that bill passed." And, when I learned about that as a writer myself, my jaw sort of dropped. That just doesn't exist, today. And I'm not sure it existed much ever before, that a writer could have that kind of impact on our landscape, on our national, legacy, and on our future. And so this partnership where there was an artist and writer, and then somebody who empowered him, his editor who empowered him, and these guys worked together for 4 decades. So there's a great body of correspondence between them, like they had a conversation going, all that time that I could tap into. But at one point, I wanted to call the book Mr. Johnson and Mr. Muir when I first started out, because everybody knew Muir, but nobody knew Johnson. And I was so excited about what a dynamic guy this was. And I could tell you about Muir's childhood. He was kind of a special guy from early on. Johnson was as well. He grew up in Centerville, Indiana. And at the age of 11, during the Civil War, he told his parents, "Hey, the station master, the train station master wants me to come work for him, and I want to do it. I'm going to go do it." And his parents are, they're like, "What? You're 11 years old. You don't need to go work." His father's a justice of the peace there. And he said, no, I want to do it. So they let him go work at the train station. He learned to operate the telegraph machine. And there was somebody down the line who sent really fast telegraphs that the older guys couldn't pick up. Johnson could. At the age of 11, he could pick up what was coming down the line. Turns out the other telegrapher was a young Thomas Edison, who was at another station. So it's Johnson and Edison sending telegraphs back and forth. And Johnson would stay at the station late at night because he loved doing it. He was just, entranced by the fact that these messages could come down the line in the middle of the night, and he could take them down and communicate. But it was during the Civil War. Sometimes they were very sad messages. He would have to get on a horse and go out and tell a family they'd lost a son. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, it was Johnson who took down the message and went out on the platform and announced it to the people there. So he was a precocious guy who was, always in a momentous place. He would go to college, a Mormon college, graduate in a class of 4, and end up in Chicago during the Great Fire there, and would document that. So kind of like Muir had a knack for being in the place where the big news was being made, and being able to comment on it and be affected by it and be in the sort of heartstream of America.
Yeah, to be kind of fortuitously placed in the right time, if you want to use that word.
Yeah, I didn't want to say the right place at the right time, because sometimes it was disaster.
Right. But for someone interested in documenting seminal events in the history of our nation, yes, he was certainly well placed by fortune, by God, by someone to be involved in these settings. Gosh, a couple things on which I want to comment, but maybe first, I'd like to contrast Underwood's Johnson's upbringing to that of Muir. So you traveled out to Scotland, as I understand it, to sort of acquaint yourself with the place and the places in which he was reared, and also in Wisconsin, to which he moved with his family at a young age, and then ultimately where he settled in California. He was, by and large, destitute, let's say, of a proper education. He was able to read Shakespeare and Milton and the Bible sparingly, and I was shocked by that after having read the beauty of his prose in his essays, that he really didn't have a very well structured formal education until he went to the University of Wisconsin. And as you noted, he was more renowned locally for his mechanical genius. He was very precocious as well in his attempts to create alarm clocks and certain other household domestic instruments that could assist him in his labors. But very little of his time was devoted to reading, and it wasn't his decision. He was, raised up in a kind of a strict Calvinistic family, and time for such literary pleasures wasn't abundant. So how do you think his life would have changed if he had been brought up in a more structured, let's say, educational environment? And that's John Muir I'm referencing.
Yes. There was one book that he was quite familiar with, and that was the Bible, which was whipped into him from an early age. He literally memorized the entire New Testament and a lot of the Old Testament. He was a very bright guy, and early on, his grandfather taught him to read and would take him out into nature in Scotland before he came to the United States. And in Wisconsin, his neighbors there realized that he was a very bright guy, and that he needed to be reading more than the Bible, the only thing that his father would allow him to bring into the house. And so they started smuggling him in books. His neighbors realized that he was a very bright kid and that he needed to be reading more than just the Bible. So they started smuggling him in books. And his father caught him reading a book one day. He had to work from dawn to dusk along with his other siblings in the fields. It was a very sort of severe life that his evangelical father imposed upon the family. But so he caught him reading, and he was frustrated with John a little bit, and he finally said, "Look, you can read, but not on my time. If it's not the Bible." And you're going to have to, as long as you're working in the morning and putting in your day, you can figure that out. So Muir invented a machine, as you mentioned, using clockwork and hinging the feet of his bed so that the clock would pull the legs out from under his bed at 1 a.m. and dump them in a pan of cold water, and so that he could get up and read. And he would read until dawn when he had to go out in the field. So even though he was an autodidact, he was very disciplined about it. Anybody who's going to wake himself up, in the middle of the night to read is probably pretty driven and getting a lot out of it, or wouldn't do it. So so he read extensively. He absorbed that, and the machines, when I started reading about Muir and then writing about him and I read about some of the machines he invented. I wasn't so sure. They seemed a little strange, but you can go to the University of Wisconsin today and see his desk, which he, again, used clockwork. He whittled the entire thing out of wood, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's a stunning thing to see. And here's a college kid who couldn't afford a desk in his room, so he whittled it out of wood. And not only that, applied a clock to it so that the desktop rotated. It was circular, rotated so that a book would stay there for 15 minutes and then move to the next one, so he could stay on a study schedule. It's really pretty stunning and not a bit odd, more than a bit odd. I mean, his room was a kind of a freak show at the University of Wisconsin. Kids would come from all over to look and see what this crazy kid from the farm had invented, or what kind of specimen he brought in from the woods, because he went out and found he was fascinated by nature and collected all kinds of items to keep in his room, and he became kind of a celebrity on campus, even with the professors, who realized that he had this he was farm raised and had this sort of country diction with a Scottish brogue, and but he was very well read, and so they were fascinated by him, and they took special notice and worked with him. And so I think, although he was only at the university for 2 years because he didn't have enough money to stay in the university, he had to go teach, and then he worked in a factory. He absorbed whatever he read very thoroughly.
Yeah, and if you're unable to go to Wisconsin and to the university at Madison and actually for yourself see these objects and these instruments, you can do as I did and get his selected writings from the Library of America. They have a fine volume, and interspersed through the writings, you'll see sketches. I think they're from his hand, original sketches of these devices, and just as you depicted, they're all eccentric, they're all extraordinary, much like the man himself, but all serving a very specific end. And I'm always just so impressed by people who are so disciplined and driven to enhance their own intellect, as he was. Now, obviously, he was gifted with some shrewdness and some wit. He was not an unintelligent person by nature. But the thought that he took advantage of his father's strict dictate not to read during working hours to rouse himself in what were probably chilly Wisconsin evenings or early mornings at 1 a.m. into cold water. Can you imagine? and just begin his cycle of reading, and reading a somewhat limited amount of books. Today we take for granted the fact that we can purchase any book on Amazon, like your fine book, and have it delivered to our house in 2 days, or to go to the local library and check it out and have it for a week. But that wasn't quite as accessible in his age. So I'm so astonished by people like him. And you read later on, you read the beauty of his prose, as I mentioned earlier, and the mastery of his language. And you're just struck by the fact that this is a man who kind of like cobbled together his own education, by and large, was totally self-driven to form his mind and to cultivate it to the best of his ability, and to put forth everlasting, evergreen works that still resonate with us so much today. So he's a great inspiration on different people, and for different reasons. Those who are ambitious to improve their understanding and their intellects, those who are simply enamored of nature, and those who want to pursue advocacy and activism. So in all these ways, he's still so incredibly influential. I want to ask, on the point of influence, deviating a little bit from Muir, do you think that there's been in the history of America any other author who has had so much influence on policy making, on the culture, on just the general idea and understanding of America? Can you think of anybody else?
Well, yeah, I think people like Emerson and Twain, both of his era, and Thoreau, and there are others who've had a great influence. In the manner that Muir did, I can't think of anybody who, could meet with his editor, come up with an idea, and then write an article and delineate the area that he thought needed to be turned into a national park and have that made. The two of them would go on to be very influential in the creation of our National Forestry Service and in preserving of what would become our national forest land. The creation of the Sierra Club, is the most powerful environmental organization of its day and perhaps of all times. Was an astounding accomplishment as well, and the influence they had on President Theodore Roosevelt, our greatest political environmental activist, was profound. So it would be hard to you could make a case that there's never been anybody quite like this.
Yeah, and I think my favorite image in your book is that of Teddy Roosevelt accompanied by John Muir out in Yosemite during his visit there. It's a striking image to see these two iconic men together. You did mention, and I was hoping you would, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So you mentioned in the book the beautiful friendship that was forged between these two men. Ralph Waldo Emerson, of course, the great New England transcendentalist, and John Muir, the great environmentalist. Now, Emerson was 3 decades Muir's elder, but he was similarly apt to divinize nature and to write in this very exalted way when thinking about the natural world. When recounting his experience with Emerson and the party by which he was being led about, Muir accused it of having been full of indoor philosophy. I just love that term. So if you can describe to us, please tell us, what is indoor philosophy and how does it contrast to Muir's understanding of an outdoor philosophy?
Well, Emerson came out with his entourage in 1871 to Yosemite, and Jean Carr, the wife of one of Muir's professors at Madison, who had moved out to California when Ezra Carr, her husband, became a professor at Berkeley, and who was Jean Carr, a real soulmate of Muir's. Now, Ezra had introduced Muir to Emerson and to keeping a journal and help form some of Muir's habits and thoughts. But Ezra, I'm sorry, Jean, really became a soulmate. They really bonded over their love of nature and would walk together. And Jean recognized Muir's brilliance and would send any intellectuals who came out to Berkeley out to see Muir in Yosemite. She would say, you've got to go out there, and people were making pilgrimages to get to Yosemite. And when you get there, you've got to have the best guide out there, and it's John Muir. One of these people was Emerson. And so Emerson got out there, and Muir was too shy, though. Jean Carr had sent him a note saying, hey, Emerson's coming out there, and I've told him he needs to meet you, and you need to go meet him. And he wouldn't penetrate the entourage and all the hoopla that was going on. And you got to remember, Muir was living out a pretty wild life in Yosemite. And so when these city folk from the Northeast came out, maybe it was a little nerve-wracking for him. But he eventually, when he found out that Emerson was going to leave, he knew he had to make his move. He sent Emerson a note. Emerson responded, and the two of them got together. And Emerson quickly, understood what a special guy Muir was. And Muir was living that life out in nature that Emerson wrote about and upheld, but Muir was actually doing it. So the indoor philosophy, here in Emerson was, past the peak of his powers. He was beginning to start to, he was older, and he was beginning to become, somewhat feeble. And so his entourage was very protective of him, as you would imagine. But Muir couldn't understand it. They wanted Emerson to sleep indoors, and Muir said, that's ridiculous. Nobody ever caught a cold in the woods. You got a lot more chance of getting sick in that stuffy boarding house that you're staying in than staying out in the woods with me. So he was sort of perplexed by the whole thing and frustrated. He really wanted to take Emerson, who had influenced him so much and who he admired so much, out into the woods and bond with him. But and Emerson understood that and wanted to do it, but really couldn't escape his people.
Yeah, and I think it's an example, perhaps a disheartening one, of not meeting one's idols. and sadly, it wasn't an altogether bad experience for Muir, as he recounts in his works, but it certainly, I think, failed to live up to his expectations of what he might achieve or what he might be able to exchange with Emerson. Let me ask you, if you were to be approached by some celebrated figure and asked to be led around any place with which you're intimately familiar, who would that figure be? Can you think of anyone?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, since I just spent 5 years studying Muir and Johnson, nothing, to be with the two of them together would have been amazing. To be with them together in Tuolumne Meadows, in Yosemite, and exploring that with them would have been, mind-boggling, and something I would have loved. I have a wide range of interests, and I would have loved to have spent some time with Doc Watson, the famous guitar player and singer who's an idol of mine. And I wanted to write a biography of him, but unfortunately, he passed away a few years back. And Abraham Lincoln, there are many people that would just be fascinating to be with and to ask a few questions of why you did this or why you didn't do that. Of Muir, I would ask him, look, why didn't you just make that trip out to Washington, D.C. during the battle for Hetchy? Because that would have been your movie moment. That would have been it right there. You on the floor. It would have been game changing, I think. And but it was something he would travel to go explore the world, to go find trees in remote places. But he really didn't like being in the bright lights. He didn't like making political statements that weren't on paper. And so. When the eventual battles on the floor of Congress came about, his opinions would be introduced through his writings. But that's all fun to speculate on. But I would say though that while Muir's greatest hopes of what he might do with Emerson, to have conversations out in the woods and enjoy the starry nights, and Muir loved to light a dead tree that still had sap in it and watch the flames. The spectacles in nature, all kinds of things. I think he did learn a lot. He learned a lot about himself, and I love it's heartbreaking, that moment where Emerson departs and is looking back at him, and you realize it is almost like this unrequited platonic love that could have happened there. But Muir's sad. He's alone a lot in the woods, and he's never sad. And that always amazed me. He's never scared or depressed being alone, because he feels fulfilled in the woods. But the moment that Emerson leaves him and he doesn't have that moment with Emerson, he feels alone. And he has to grapple with it. All of a sudden, he has to sit there and get back in touch with himself and with nature, hear the birds, light his campfire, and gain his peace back. And then he grapples with, Emerson wanted him to come out to Harvard and lecture there. And so he had to grapple with that. When your idol asks you to come, to the hallowed halls of Harvard and lecture, that's a great honor. But Muir knew that what made him special, I think, was that he lived this life of spirituality, that others might profess but weren't living. Emerson, had these lofty ideals and wonderful realization of the value and beauty and splendor of nature, but he didn't live it the way Muir did. And I think that's what Emerson admired in Muir, and what Muir came to understand about himself was that's the gift he brought.
So you preempted the question that I was going to pose, and that's fine. And you answered it eloquently and beautifully. And that was, what sort of questions might you pose to John Muir if you had the opportunity? And I think that's an excellent one to pose. I want to mention, between Emerson, the theoretician, and Muir, the one who lived the experiences, I suppose we can place Henry David Thoreau as something of an intermediary. He certainly wasn't as, I think, accomplished a writer as an Emerson, but he did go out to Walden Pond and he built his own little, habitation there, although he wasn't too far away from civilization. But he still, in many ways, enacted that life about which Emerson solely wrote. And I think Muir took it to another degree, and he really immersed himself in nature more thoroughly. So I detect like a little bit of a lineage, and maybe it's chronological as well. There's Emerson, sort of the elder, sage-like philosopher of nature, and then you have Emerson, his first acolyte, also in the New England area, who was able to, in some ways, moderate ways, enact some of that philosophy and also to expand on it. And then you have Muir, who's the sort of the West Coast, avant-garde type of real true rough liver of that philosophy, a practitioner as well, but also one who really truly made it a part of his everyday life physically. So yeah, that's like really an interesting lineage to draw. And of course, I encourage everyone, if you haven't read Emerson, if you haven't read Thoreau, and Muir as well, pick up their books and read them either prior to Dean's book or even afterward, or supplement them. Read them simultaneously, because it's this just wonderful aggregation of beautiful prose and deep, profound insights that will really fill you up with a love of nature that you probably didn't realize was in you. Now, I find that I take great enjoyment in being out in nature, and I think most people do. Was that enough for him? I mean, of course, you described so beautifully the feeling of sadness that overcame him when he was distanced from Emerson, between whom he had that unrequited platonic love. But do you think that nature alone sufficed for a man like Muir, and do you think it suffices for many of us?
Well, I think nature is a piece of the pie or the puzzle, and even for Muir, Muir would eventually always come back to quote unquote civilization, or the city, or other folks he married. He had two daughters that he doted on and loved, and had a wonderful family life. He worked on his wife's family's fruit ranch, and eventually took over the running of it. And so he did have a very rich life, both in nature. I mean, he had an ability to go out, to take a loaf of bread and maybe a jar of meat juice and some tea or coffee, and go out for 5 days climbing and exploring a remote part of Yosemite, virtually on nothing, with no bed, no tent. He could, so he did amazing things out in nature, but he read always, and loved to read. And before Emerson and Thoreau, there was the Bible, and Burns, and Alexander von Humboldt had a big influence on him. So you're right that he did. He drew from all these places. And when I first started thinking about doing a book about John Muir, I read Lenny Marsh Wolf's Pulitzer Prize winning biography, and it was both enlightening and fun, and also discouraging, because Muir had this sprawling life. He was so good at so many things, but he was kind of the second or third best at a lot of them. And so I had to think, what's great about Muir? Why do we need to remember him? What did he do that was so special? And I realized that I needed to cut a narrative through. The Wolf biography takes you all over the world, to Alaska with Muir, and what I realized I needed to do was find the clean narrative arc that described what Muir did that was so phenomenal. And so I found what he did best, and I really think what he brought was this passion for the wilderness. And so while his idea that all things are connected probably initially came from von Humboldt, and then a little bit through Emerson, he made that phrase more famous and more well-known through his passion in writing, and the spiritual element, I think, that he brought to it, because it was very deeply ingrained in him, this spirituality. Even though his father had been so tough and so severe in his religious beliefs, it didn't turn Muir off from that basic faith that he had, but he had to find out his own version of it, and that was in his relationship with nature, and that that nature was the greatest manifestation of the God he worshipped, and where people needed to come to find their spiritual fulfillment. So we might tend to think that the Sierra Club was created to protect nature. It wasn't. The Sierra Club was created to bring people to nature. And that's what Muir's whole ethos was he didn't want to keep people out of nature. He didn't believe in pristine, nature. He wanted to bring people to nature. And he always wanted to do something good for humanity from the time he was a kid. And he had wonderful powers. He knew that he considered, I could be a man of the cloth. I could work in manufacturing. He understood that nature brought us, physical things that made our physical lives better. And that, he worked in a factory that made broom handles and shovel handles. And he would actually go in and look at the machinery, and after about a week say, hey, we need to redo this whole thing. He would retool the production line, and it would produce twice as fast. But I think the fact that I love that discovery, that that the factory work and the manufacturing he also valued. But at the time, you got to remember, he lived from the Civil War to World War I. This was the age of industrialization. It was Reconstruction. It was the time of the Transcontinental Railroad coming together. And America was about growing economically and achieving power, might, and riches. There wasn't anybody else saying, hey, we need to save nature for other things, for our spiritual growth and for recreation and peace of mind. And so that's what he did that I think was truly extraordinary.
We're living in an age in which the sense of the numinous, the sense of the transcendent, about which Emerson and Muir wrote so eloquently, is waning. Do you think that a reintroduction to nature can perhaps be a remedy to that waning feeling in our modern culture and society?
I do. I think a lot of people find solace in nature, and you can see that our national parks are overwhelmed currently, and an issue we need to grapple with. But um, you know, we're going through maybe a pretty tough time. I think everybody can feel that, and I do think that, with the planet threatened the way it is, that getting back to nature, maybe stripping down our lives to a certain extent, will bring us closer to nature. And there again, that's what another thing that Muir tried to achieve through the Sierra Club and other means, was when he brought people to nature, he had full faith that they would come to nature, love nature, and protect nature. So if those things are happening today, and I think they still are happening frequently, maybe our polarization has gotten in the way of our appreciation for the more powerful and meaningful things in life. I think there's a certain materialistic bent we have now that hopefully maybe will be calmed at some point. But so I do think one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is because I think he is an exemplar of the man who found, or the person who found, meaning in nature and really didn't need much else. He would go out. My favorite scenes are when he'll go out, into the mountains, and it'll start snowing, and all of a sudden there'll be a blizzard, and you'll be like, "Oh my gosh, is he going to survive this?" And he'll build a lean-to, go into the lean-to, and a bird will fly in, and he'll be feeding it, crumbs of his bread, taking care of the bird. And in the morning, he'll go out and look at the bear tracks and the deer tracks, and then catch snow crystals on his hand and look at the crystals and describe those. So, in his feats of exploration, on foot, climbing in the Sierra Nevada, and up the peaks of the Sierra Nevada and all around, are inspiring. And so that's one thing that I hope people discover in the book is the beauty of the life he led, the meaning that he found. And I think a lot of people will connect with that.
Oh, they certainly will. And I can say that confidently because I'm one of said people who connected with that. Again, it was through your book that I was inspired to go back and read Muir's work in the original, and was completely uplifted by it and completely moved by it. I do think that there is something profoundly almost ineffable about nature, being in nature, and the way in which it makes you feel. And I think by and large, our distance from nature is a great detriment to us all collectively. And I think only if we were to spend a little bit more time outside with the sunlight on our skin, feeling the breeze through our hair, feeling the grass beneath our feet, we would find that much of our daily stresses are, if not completely eradicated, then at least significantly diminished. So that's my little pitch for just going outside. And it doesn't have to be in the Hetchy. It doesn't have to be on top of some great mountain overlooking a beautiful valley below. But finding yourself a little patch of earth on which you can connect with things greater than yourself. I know that you're a very active man, Dean. Is there any specific practice that you implement in your day? Do you, for instance, go outside and sit down and meditate? Do you think a certain thought when you're outside, or do you just sort of go about and, I don't know, maybe go about somewhat thoughtlessly? I tend to think that's not the case with you, but do you have a specific practice to which you adhere every day?
Well, I think we all have our rituals that keep us balanced, and because I do what I do, I'm writing, I'm reading and writing and contemplating notions. I lived with Muir for 5 years, thinking about his writing, and so I have my routines, and partly with my dog, we do our certain things, and we go outside together, and I know where my dog's going to go. And it's almost it's a wonderful relationship. Walk the dog every day. And physical activities, I like to work out and feel my body. And I think at the same time, if you're running, you're feeling the road. If you're riding a bike, whatever you're doing, you're interacting. I mean, we are part of nature. We're animals, and so I think being physical has always meant a lot to me, and so in pushing myself in seeing what my body can take, and whether it's I do a lot of cross country walking. I guess that would be the other thing is I love to do end to end walking. I've walked across England twice. I've walked the Welsh border. I've walked a good bit over across France and various places in the U.S. So whenever possible, I get out. I think even when my wife and I like to drive across country a lot, we put our GPS on no highways and no tolls, and get on just that little acts like that, getting and again, that's being in human nature and seeing little towns, and it's so much fascinating. There's not a boring road, when you're not on a highway. They're all fascinating. And so I think it's connecting and noticing. And I would say with Muir, Muir had the mind of an engineer. When he was building those machines and fixing factory lines, he's keenly observant and has the ability to slow himself down and be present. And that's something I learned a lot from reading Muir. And trying to incorporate, in my own life, and also in reading his prose. Is if I was trying to read through a book really fast to accomplish something, to get somewhere, I would not enjoy it, and I wouldn't take much out of it. I had to slow down to his pace, and when I did, the writing's absolutely spectacular. And as you were saying, Muir could find beauty in nature in a flower, in a factory yard, or in a weed in the factory yard, or in an ant, the tiniest thing. And, which takes us to that his most famous quote, I'm paraphrasing, all things are connected. The biggest mountain's connected to the littlest blade of grass. And, he understood that way back when. It's something now that we really, need to understand, is that the way we care for, any bit of nature, is important. Every bit of nature, particularly as the human population has grown. We all need to be very mindful of how we understand and treat the natural world.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of William Blake's famous introduction to William Blake's poem. I think it's Auguries of Innocence, and he says, to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, to take these minuscule parts of nature, almost invisible to the undiscerning eye or to the typical eye, and to really appreciate the grandeur in them, the fact that there is this I don't know, inscrutable connection between all things. So yeah, it's something that really resonates with me as something of a fan of the Romantics and their progeny, people like Emerson, Thoreau, and Muir. And it always strikes me as just being profoundly moving and beautiful. And I think it does to many people as well. Now, changing directions just slightly. In late July of 2020, at the fevered height of our national convulsion, Michael Brune, the executive director of the Sierra Club, circulated a memo entitled "Pulling Down Our Monuments." In it, he takes the club's venerated founder and the subject of your book, John Muir, to task. The two crimes of which Brune accuses Muir are maintaining friendships with people who subscribe to the pseudoscientific theory of eugenics and making derogatory comments about Black and Indigenous people. Now, in preparation for this conversation and inspired by your works, I've read all of Muir's writings, and I can say, frankly, his comments about Black and Indigenous peoples are surprisingly tame. And I don't mean to sound insensitive when I say that, but having read a lot of literature through many different ages, I can say that there is much worse than that you can find. Now, you acknowledge the controversy surrounding Muir in your book. I think in the maybe in the preface. Can you maybe comment on that a little bit? You can be honest. Do you think that it's a little overblown? Do you think that Brune was incorrect in circulating this memo? Can we restore Muir to, universal adoration, or do we still need to look more penetratingly at his comments and castigate him for them?
It's a complex issue, and I do think Brune was misguided, sadly misguided. I think that what he wanted to do was correct the course that the Sierra Club was taking. And the easiest path for him to do that was to go back to the founder and sort of shake the foundation of the organization. I think he was doing it for good reasons, but I don't think it was historically accurate or fair to Muir. And I do think it's important for us to re-examine all our historical figures, and continue to look at them. I'm not a big fan of monuments. I think you put up monuments and all of a sudden you crystallize something. It's no longer living and alive. And in all my histories that I've written, I'm trying to tear down those monuments. I'm trying to make the people real again. So I wouldn't say Muir was perfect, but I do think that racism certainly wasn't something he ascribed to or believed in. Eugenics is never a word he ever mentioned. And the treatise that somebody who he was associated with, who was a very prominent cultural figure in New York City, wrote, he didn't write until after Muir had passed away. So I think that was really smearing to ascribe the thoughts of friends to particularly when you're in this intellectual circle of people who are very strong-minded and have very different ideas. When Muir never suggested that he believed in anything like some of these ideas. So I think that was very unfair. I also think that if you read Muir carefully, that you will see that he admired Native Americans, and particularly, and he talked about their light impact on nature, their ability to live more harmoniously with nature. And he castigated white people who were tearing nature down. So Muir did not mince words, and so he would say what he thought, but he would also, because he was an engineer, and he describes, when you read his writings, he describes so beautifully and meticulously many things. At one point he's criticized for saying that a group of Native Americans were dirty. Well, he meant they were physically dirty. They had dirt, and they'd been degraded. I think he called them degraded. They'd been degraded by white people who had taken their land. And, so I think some of this was out of context. Early on in his life, when he walked the 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf, and he encountered some black people. I don't think he had encountered many black people in his life before that. And, he's pretty bald in his descriptions. And I think, they can not read great today. And but again, I think you're really taking this out of context, because I don't think anything that he wrote was meant maliciously. And I think he was he was a champion of the poor and the weak and the downtrodden, and people who were dealt with unfairly. From the beginning, from his family, once he left home, he left his siblings behind who still had their tyrannical father, and he constantly wrote them and sent his siblings and sent them money and supported them and tried to get them out of the house and help them. He understood what it was meant to be oppressed. And, I guess that question about another thing that, if I could be with Muir, what I would ask him, like, why didn't you go to DC? That would have been that great moment. another, I do wish, because he was such an intelligent and aware, alert person, I do wish he had come out and said something about the indigenous people. I think you have to remember, he's so focused on fighting for nature in a world that was all around him. You had timber mills tearing down 3,000-year-old sequoias, and and there was nobody else trying to protect them. So he had very clear battle lines. He had a big battle he was fighting. It was to preserve nature from America in a lot of ways. So it's almost too much to ask him to have fought other battles, but boy, it would have been nice if he'd made a good, strong statement. Though he did say, all people, he did say at various points, all people are equal, all people are part of God, and we're put here by God, and so I think it's there. And so I do think what happened with Michael Brune was very unfortunate, and there was a backlash, and Brune resigned, and yet what he said still lingers a bit.
Yeah, and I thank you for that elucidation. I think it was very clear-sighted and very even-handed. I agree. Having not known much about Brune prior to his statement, I can say that it was, on the whole, misbegotten. And it required me only to read Muir's writings to realize the erroneous crimes, so to speak, attributed to him. One being, of course, mere association or friendship with other people who ascribe to the theory of eugenics. So if you're culpable for your friend's thoughts, then I don't know how anyone remains guiltless in this world. And also, like you said, of the supposed racism. I took down two quotes, and I just want to read them for everyone to understand exactly how Muir thought. In reference to an indigenous woman he encountered in the Sierra, he says, quote, "From no point of view that I have found are such debased fellow beings, Indians or natives, a whit more natural than the glaring tailored tourists we saw that frightened the birds and squirrels." So, in other words, he kind of holds humanity in its entirety to a certain level of opprobrium. Now, of course, he loves humanity, but he's critical of humanity universally, and I found that trend repeated in his works. It's not as though he's pointing to the Native American woman specifically, the indigenous woman, and saying that she is failing nature and that she's uncleanly, and he wishes that, like the animals that he sees about him, she could be as clean and hygienic as them.
Daniel, if I may,
yeah.
But you have to see the context of everything that Muir has said before about Native Americans and how much they are closer to nature, to understand that the key word there is the debased. Who debased this woman? It was the white settlers who came out and ran them off their land. And Muir didn't do that. Yosemite Valley in that area had been cleared. Native Americans had been removed during the gold rush. In the early 1850s, almost 2 decades before Muir came there. So again, while he might have fought that battle and said, "Hey, maybe we should, they should have access to this land," but they did. There were still Native Americans there, as this woman that he saw. He instead was fighting against the destruction of all the land by the white people. But so you have to know the context to know how to read that passage. And I'm not saying you didn't read it correctly, but I think a lot of people would miss out on the fact that he's saying this debased woman is not as natural as they were.
Right. Thank you for contextualizing that a little bit more thoroughly. You're absolutely right in having done so. I suppose the only point that I was making, and it's on Muir's behalf, it's that he was so enamored of nature that he saw, any desecration of it or any sort of deviation from it as just that, whether it came from the white civilized man or the brown-skinned uncivilized person. But no, thank you for filling that picture out a little bit better, because I think that's necessary. I think I want to end with maybe just one more question, and you've been extraordinarily generous with your time. If John Muir were alive today, whom would he be? Do you think he'd be the same person? Would he be like a survivor man? Would he be Les Stroud? Do you think he'd be carrying around a recorder and filming himself as he went about his day and sort of vlogging about it? Do you think he'd be a podcast host? Would he be an off-the-grid blogger, an advocate, an activist, a political leader? If he were alive in 2023, what sort of role do you think he would occupy?
I'm trying to think of somebody today that I think he would be like the young Scandinavian woman whose name is escaping me right now. Who's
Greta Thunberg?
Yeah. I think she would probably be. She's the current embodiment of Muir. He would be that voice out there. Maybe because the situation's different, he would be calling attention to nature and the beauty of nature and the threats to nature in the way that she is. That would be the greatest parallel. Of course, there were he was trying to bring people to those parks. He couldn't have anticipated maybe the population boom and how now we have millions of people going to Yosemite. But he knew. I mean, early on, he was saying we're going to need that Hetchy Valley. It was very similar to Yosemite Valley. It's now under 200 feet of water, but he knew that we were going to need that remote place for people to go have the experiences that he had. Whether or not cutting 5 million people a year, down to 2.5 million in each place, whether it would really dent that effect, I don't know. But I do love when I speak and I talk about my research. I was there in Yosemite Valley last October, and I have a gorgeous photograph where I'm on the valley floor. It's sunset and the light is hitting Half Dome in just the perfect way to light up the dome. And my wife takes a photograph, and there's not another soul in that image of the valley floor. You can find your moments of peace and solace there even today. We went and found the bull tree. It's in Sequoia National Forest. We drove 3 miles down dirt roads, hiked in 1.5 miles, and we sat with the largest remaining giant sequoia in what was called the Converse Basin in the Sequoia National Forest for over an hour by ourselves and never saw another soul. So, if you go and are willing and able to get off the beaten path, you can still find great moments of solitude and peace and that sort of spiritual fulfillment that Muir wanted us to have. But, what his solution to this overcrowding would have been, I'm not really, I don't know. I think he would have pointed out that, hey, there are a lot of beautiful places around. There are gorgeous places in state parks, many other national parks, national monuments in your own backyard, in the park in your city. You can find these wonderful places. It's a great question. Great thing to think about.
Thank you. And you may not have seen another soul on that gorgeous evening or the sunrise of the next, but I think you almost certainly felt another soul, and that was the collective soul of, or maybe even the individual souls collected of the trees and the bushes and the grass. And I can tell that you probably have that ability almost intangibly to sense the spirit that's all around you and that permeates all of nature. And you mentioned the beauty, and I want to hover on that for our last question. Muir was of the conviction that, quote, everybody needs beauty as well as bread. In issuing his opinion thus, he was in some ways paraphrasing one of the New Testament's famous lines located in Matthew, that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. So what thinkest thou, Dean? Do we need beauty as well as bread, or will bread alone suffice?
I think Muir, as you just pointed out, said it wonderfully, and I think it is ultimately where we find meaning in life, and whether it's in nature or it's in music or visual arts or dance or so many ways, combined with our whatever spirituality we have. I think these are great ways to help us interpret the world and our experience, and to take joy in it, and to use our senses to appreciate life, in the moment. And it's so important, particularly when, we're going through an era of isolation, and experiencing many things on screens. And, not that I don't love things on screens, but you need a balance. I love Muir when they proposed the national forests, and Congress had to approve it, and Muir wrote a story to give to the people in Atlantic Monthly, to tell them, look, we need to do this. He described the trees as being alive, and he talked about their motion and their, and this is pretty, I think we understand today much better how living plants speak to each other, they communicate, they do all kinds of things we never could have fathomed. But Muir, I think, really understood the lives of these things. And I think, when a giant sequoia 3,000 years old was cut down, he understood the power of that moment, the sadness, the tragedy of it, and the sort of holy beauty in, well, everything from the blade of grass to the tree, but the tree you can't, 3,000-year-old tree you can't replace. So I think this ultimately is about the beauty that we find in life, and Muir found it especially in nature, especially in Yosemite Valley, which he believed was a natural cathedral.
Yeah. A cathedral in which we are all welcome, regardless of our religious belief or our ethnic ancestry or our current opinions. It's truly an ecumenical cathedral, and I hope that everybody takes some time to reacquaint themselves with this majestic place. So, Dean, I think this has been an extraordinary conversation, so enlightening. Of course, I highly, highly recommend everyone to go out and get themselves a copy of your fine book. It's available, at all your reputable booksellers. It's on Amazon. It's at Barnes and Noble. It's at your local library. Be sure to disseminate it to some friends and family, as the holidays approach. I think it's a fine read for any time of the year, but especially perhaps then when you're cramped up inside in the cold and you're thinking about a warm California day, or you're thinking about John Muir out in the snowy passes of the mountainous terrain. You ended with that last question beautifully. Are there any other comments with which you'd like to leave us today? Any ideas or opinions, anything at all?
Well, I think the Muir also foresaw that, he may have accomplished a lot for nature, but he knew that it was a continuing struggle, that we would always have this struggle, partly because of the physical need to use nature and the spiritual need. And he understood both. And he recognized and gave each its due. But he said this is kind of ultimately a fight between good and evil. You cannot cut out either side of that equation. And I think we are right in the crux of that matter today. And so I'm hoping that the book and reading Muir will inspire people to get involved. Every little act that we take in our own lives, in our communal lives, is critical.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself. And as I said, your book was something of a springboard for me to delve more deeply into the works of Muir, which has been endlessly gratifying. And to you, speaking of endless gratification and gratitude, I'm infinitely grateful for you for having joined me today and having bestowed upon me and all of our listeners so much good information, for having put out all your excellent works with which you should be filling your Amazon carts as we speak. So, Dean, thank you again. You've been so generous with your time, so thoughtful in your responses, hopefully the questions I posed were provocative enough to inspire some thoughtful responses. That's always my goal here, to kind of ask a couple different questions that you might not normally receive, and you handle them all eloquently and masterfully, and I think all to our benefit. So again, I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of Dean's latest work, to check out his social media pages, to check out his personal website, maybe perhaps some of the productions forthcoming from your company, the Gum Street production company, of which you're a founder and in which you're a partner. And with that, I'm going to bid thee all farewell. Of course, I am your humble host, Daniel Finneran. Please consider liking this episode, subscribing to this channel, sharing it with friends, and continuing with me to enjoy these great conversations. Thank you.